Curiosity had overwhelmed propriety, that dangerous impulse which had undone many men far greater than Harrison Webb. The knock echoed too loudly in the narrow corridor. For several seconds, there was no answer. Webb adjusted his gloves, already regretting the visit, already rehearsing how he would explain himself if the wrong person saw him standing there. Finally, the door opened no more than 6 inches. A woman's eye appeared in the crack, dark, sharp, measuring. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, her hair pulled back tight, her shoulders squared in the defensive posture of someone long accustomed to bad news. "Yes," she said. Professor Webb removed his hat at once. "Mrs. Johnson, I presume. My name is Harrison Webb. I'm a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I believe your daughter." The door opened wider, then stopped. "My daughter hasn't done anything wrong," the woman said quickly. "If she broke something at the Institute, I'll pay it back. It may take time, but—" No, Webb said, startled. "On the contrary, I've come because of something extraordinary." That word, extraordinary, hung between them like a threat. After a moment's hesitation, the woman stepped aside. "You may come in, but you'll speak plain, sir." The room was small, barely large enough for the iron bed, a washstand, and a narrow table pushed against the wall. A single window rattled in its frame, frost creeping along the edges of the glass. In the corner sat a coal stove, barely warm. And there, at the table, hunched over a slate board, was Lydia Johnson. She was smaller than Webb expected. Thin. Her dress had been mended so many times, it was hard to tell what color it had once been. Her hair was braided neatly, though strands had escaped and curled against her temples. She looked up as he entered, eyes widening. "I'm sorry," she said, immediately standing. "I didn't mean to touch anything I wasn't supposed to. I won't go back. I promise." Webb felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. "No," he said softly. "Lydia, I want you to tell me how you touched it." She froze. Her mother crossed her arms. "She cleans the lecture rooms with me in the evenings. She waits while I work. She's quiet. She doesn't cause trouble." Webb nodded. "I know. That's precisely why I'm here." He stepped closer to the table. On the slate board were chalk markings, symbols, arrows, curves, nothing as formal as what he'd seen on the laboratory blackboard, but unmistakably mathematical. Not childish doodles. Not mimicry. Real work. "Who taught you this?" he asked. Lydia shook her head. "No one, sir." "That's not possible," he said gently. She hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "I see it. When numbers are wrong, they feel loud, like a bell ringing out of tune. I just move them until it stops hurting." The room went silent. Her mother looked at her sharply. "Lydia." "It's all right," Webb said, though his hands were trembling now. "What happens when you see equations?" Lydia looked down at her fingers, chalk still dusting her skin. "They're shapes, like bridges before they're built. I can see where they'll break." Webb sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. In 30 years of mathematics, he had met prodigies. He had met savants. He had met men who could compute faster than machines. But this was something else entirely. This was intuition, untrained, unfiltered, untouched by academic language. This was genius in its rawest form. And it terrified him. Because if Lydia Johnson was real, if her mind truly worked this way, then everything the Institute believed about intelligence, education, and hierarchy was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. "Mrs. Johnson," Webb said slowly, "your daughter is operating at a level beyond most trained mathematicians in the country." Her mother laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Then you'll take her away from me." The bluntness of it struck him. "No," he said quickly, "I want to help her." "That's the same thing," Clara Johnson replied. "Help always costs us something." Lydia watched them both, silent now. Webb stood. I won't lie to you. If others learn about her, there will be pressure. There will be men who want to study her, to use her. There will be danger. Then why come at all? Clara asked. Because the truth, Webb realized, was unbearable. Because once seen, it could not be unseen. Because if he walked away, he would spend the rest of his life knowing that the greatest mathematical mind he had ever encountered was cleaning chalk dust off floors at night. I came, he said, quietly, because the world is not prepared for your daughter. But it will be. And when it is, someone must remember that she was here first. Outside, the wind howled down the narrow street. Inside that cold boarding house, Harrison Webb understood that his life's work was already over. What came next would not be discovery. It would be reckoning. Now she spoke, her voice steady but tight, like a rope pulled too far. She's not showing off, Clara said. She's not trying to shame anyone. She's just like this. She's been like this since she could talk. Webb turned to her slowly. Since when? Since she was small, Clara said. 3, maybe 4. She would count things that weren't there. Not buttons or coins. She'd count the spaces between them. The pauses. I thought she was playing. Then she started correcting me when I measured cloth for sewing. Told me my cuts would waste fabric. She was right. Lydia looked embarrassed. Mama. I'm telling it, Clara said gently, because you won't. She faced Webb fully now. You must understand something, Professor. Every time my child opens her mouth and sounds smarter than she's supposed to be, it puts her in danger. Intelligence doesn't protect girls like her. It marks them. Webb swallowed. He knew this was true. He knew it in theory. But seeing it, hearing it spoken so plainly, made it heavier. I won't pretend the world is fair, he said. But I also can't pretend this gift doesn't exist. Lydia is operating at a level that, frankly, redefines what we think is possible. Clara laughed softly, without humor. Possible for who? The question landed like a blow. Webb had no good answer. Instead, he asked Lydia, do you enjoy it? The mathematics. She nodded immediately. Yes, sir. It feels quiet. When things make sense. What happens when you can't do it? He asked. She frowned, thinking, that doesn't really happen. Webb closed his notebook. His hands were shaking now, openly. In that moment, he understood the terrible truth. Lydia Johnson was not a curiosity. She was not a prodigy to be admired and shelved. She was a threat, not to safety, but to structure, to hierarchy, to every carefully constructed lie about who was capable of what. If the Institute embraced her, it would have to explain her, and explanation would destroy them. I need to be honest, Webb said. If I report this officially, there will be consequences. Committees, boards, men who will want to study Lydia like a specimen, others who will deny her existence entirely, some who will say she must be lying, or that you trained her in secret. I didn't, Clara said. I can barely read. I know, Webb said quietly. That's the problem. Silence filled the room again. The wind rattled the window. Somewhere below, someone coughed violently. Finally, Lydia spoke. Am I in trouble? Webb looked at her, really looked. 13 years old. Brilliant beyond measure. Terrified of being noticed. No, he said. But you are at a crossroads. He stood. I'm going to make a proposal. And you should think very carefully before agreeing. Clara crossed her arms. I'm listening. There is a woman, Webb said. A colleague of mine. Dr. Eleanor Fitch. She studies mathematics privately. She's not welcome in most academic circles because she's a woman, which makes her ideal. Why? Clara asked. Because she understands what it means to be excluded, Webb said, and because she has no loyalty to the Institute. He continued, choosing each word carefully. If you allow it, Lydia could study with her quietly, privately. No enrollment, no records, no publicity, just learning. And afterward, Clara asked. Webb hesitated. I don't know yet. That's not good enough, Clara said. I agree, Webb said, but it's the safest path I can see. Lydia's eyes lit up. I could learn more? Yes, Webb said. Things even I don't fully understand. She smiled then, a small, cautious smile, like someone testing whether joy was allowed. Clara watched her, then closed her eyes briefly. You must promise me something, she said to Webb. If this becomes dangerous, if people start asking questions, you will walk away. You will not sacrifice my child to make your career. Webb met her gaze. I swear it. It was the most important oath of his life. Over the next year, Lydia Johnson became a ghost scholar. Twice a week, after dark, she slipped into Dr. Fitch's parlor through the back entrance. There were no blackboards there, only paper, charcoal, and a piano no one played. Fitch quickly realized chalk constrained Lydia's thinking. She preferred drawing systems, whirls, spirals, intersecting planes, then translating them into equations afterward. By age 14, Lydia had independently derived principles that would not formally exist for decades. She intuited chaos theory before the term had meaning. She described feedback loops, nonlinear instability, and emergent behavior using metaphors of water, wind, and crowds. Fitch wept the first time Lydia solved a problem she herself had failed to crack. This girl, she told Webb later, is not just ahead of her time. She's outside of it. But secrets do not stay buried. In the spring of 1899, a visiting German mathematician saw Lydia's work by accident. One glance was enough. Within weeks, rumors spread. By summer, the Institute's board demanded answers. And by autumn, Harrison Webb was summoned to a closed-door meeting where the word impossible was used 14 times and the word girl like an insult. They did not ask whether Lydia was real. They asked how to make her disappear. But Lydia Johnson was no longer a child scribbling in margins. She was a mind that had seen too much to go back into silence. And the moment the world tried to cage her brilliance, it would learn the final, most dangerous truth of all. You can suppress a voice. You cannot suppress a structure that already exists. Thorne read every scrap of information he could obtain. Most of it was rumor, speculation, or outright invention, but that only sharpened his focus. A colored girl, mathematical genius, night sessions at MIT. He dismissed the details and fixated on the implication. If such a child existed, and if her abilities were genuine, then the foundation of his life's work was at risk. His theories did not merely describe the world as he believed it was. They justified laws, institutions, and violence. To allow an exception would be to invite collapse. So, he decided the girl must be exposed, measured, reduced. Thorne wrote to MIT under the pretense of academic curiosity. He requested access, collaboration, verification. His letters were polite, methodical, and deeply dangerous. The Institute did not reply. Silence, however, only confirmed his suspicions. Institutions did not hide frauds. They hid truths that frightened them. In Boston, Webb felt the pressure tightening like a vice. The board urged discretion. The Globe continued to probe. Southern editors mocked the rumor while simultaneously amplifying it. Lydia, meanwhile, continued to learn at a speed that unsettled even those who admired her. She no longer waited for instruction. She arrived with questions about time's symmetry, about whether physical constants were truly constant, about whether mathematics described reality or merely approximated it. Webb sometimes struggled to answer. Other times he simply listened. One night, As Lydia erased a board filled with equations that would not be formally named for decades, she paused. "Professor," she said, "why can't I come here in the daytime?" Webb hesitated. "Because the world isn't ready." She considered that. "Will it ever be?" "I hope so," he said. It was the weakest answer he had ever given her. The danger arrived quietly, not with mobs or police, but with paperwork. MIT received notice of a formal inquiry, external review, prompted by concerns over unauthorized research practices and misuse of institutional facilities. Thorne's fingerprints were all over it. The board panicked. Some trustees argued the experiment had gone too far. Others insisted Lydia be removed immediately before reputational damage became irreversible. Clara was summoned to a meeting she was never meant to attend. They spoke around her, not her. They debated Lydia as if she were an abstract variable. Risk, liability, precedent, optics. Finally, Clara stood. "My daughter is not your secret," she said. "She is not your problem to solve and hide." No one answered her directly. That night, Webb went to her boarding house alone. "They're going to end it," he said, quietly. "They'll say the arrangement was informal, unofficial. They'll deny everything." "And Lydia?" Clara asked. "They'll tell her she can't come back." Clara nodded once. "Then we leave." Webb's chest tightened. "Thorne is involved. If you disappear now, he'll follow. He'll say it proves fraud." Clara looked at him with something between fear and resolve. "If we stay, they'll cage her." Lydia, listening from the doorway, spoke softly. "I don't want to disappear." Both adults turned to her. "I want to be seen," she said. "Not like a monster. Like a person who knows things." Webb understood then that the Institute had already failed her. Protection through erasure was still erasure. The decision was made not by committees, but by consequence. A leaked letter appeared in print. Not Lydia's name, but enough detail to make denial impossible. A nighttime student, a prodigy, a scandal. MIT shut the doors, and Lydia Johnson, 15 years old, stood at the edge of a world that had glimpsed her brilliance and recoiled. What followed would not be quiet, and history, when it finally spoke her name, would not do so gently. Theoretical mathematicians from true engineers. Thorne felt the room tilt slightly beneath him. This was not a trained parrot. This was comprehension. "Calculate both," he snapped, "and show your work." Lydia nodded once. She took the chalk they offered her and stood at the board. For several minutes, the room was silent except for the soft scrape of chalk. She organized the given values, corrected an assumption embedded in the load distribution, and rewrote the parabolic equation to account for wind-induced oscillation. Something Thorne had not included, because the mathematics to describe it were still unsettled in contemporary literature. Professor Hamilton leaned forward. Cartwright stopped taking notes and simply stared. When Lydia stepped back, the board was filled with equations, diagrams, and a final box result. Two numbers labeled clearly: theoretical maximum and practical failure threshold. The latter was significantly lower. Thorne approached the board slowly, reading each line. His face drained of color. He checked the arithmetic, then the logic, then the assumptions. He found no error. Worse, he found insight. The oscillation term Lydia had introduced explained a series of unexplained bridge failures that engineers had quietly blamed on material flaws. "This is impossible," Thorne said flatly. Webb spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. "Yet, it is correct." Thorne turned on him. "You coached her." "I did not," Webb replied. "I couldn't have." Thorne's hands clenched. "Then she is an anomaly. A freak. An aberration that proves nothing." Lydia looked at him steadily. "Sir," she said, "if I am an anomaly, then your theories should be able to explain me. But they can't. The words landed like a gunshot. For a moment, no one breathed. Hamilton cleared his throat. Dr. Thorne, whatever one believes about race, this child demonstrates cognitive abilities that exceed established norms. That is precisely why she must be examined further, Thorne said. Her skull measurements, brain mass, facial angles. Webb stood abruptly. No, the board representative frowned. Professor Webb? She will not be reduced to calipers and phrenology, Webb said. This is not science. It is ideology. Thorne smiled thinly. Then you admit fear. If your claims are true, measurements should confirm them. Lydia spoke again, quietly. Will those measurements help me learn more? No one answered. The panel recessed for deliberation. Lydia was escorted back into the hallway where Clara waited, gripping her daughter's hands as if afraid someone might take her away mid-breath. Inside the room, the decision was swift and merciless. Public acknowledgement was deemed inadvisable. Further examination was recommended. Off-campus, under controlled conditions, Lydia's education at MIT would be suspended temporarily. Thorne would publish a preliminary statement casting doubt on the claims, framing Lydia as a trained curiosity rather than an independent intellect. The Institute would neither confirm nor deny her existence. Containment dressed as caution. That evening, Webb went to the boarding house one last time. They're going to erase her, he said. Quietly. Effectively. Clara nodded. Then we leave tonight. Webb hesitated. If you do, Thorne will call it proof she was never real. Let him, Clara said. My daughter's life is not evidence for his lies. Lydia looked between them. If I disappear, she asked, will the mathematics disappear too? No, Webb said, his voice breaking. It never does. They left before dawn. No farewell. No records. No forwarding address. Within months, Thorne published a paper debunking the Boston myth, citing lack of cooperation as proof of fraud. The globe moved on. MIT returned to normal daylight lectures. Bridges continued to fail in inexplicable ways. And somewhere beyond the reach of institutions that feared her mind, Lydia Johnson kept learning. History would not record her name, but the equations would remember her. Exhibit A in some new taxonomy of difference, another specimen pinned to a board instead of a mind allowed to breathe. Hamilton's suggestion of a recess was accepted quickly, too quickly. Lydia was escorted back to her chair, instructed not to move. The panel clustered at the far end of the room, voices lowered but not low enough. Webb caught fragments, necessary for completeness. Standard scientific procedure. Thorne will not back down. We must appear thorough. Appearances. Always appearances. When they returned, Thorne carried a small wooden case. He set it on the table with deliberate care and opened it. Inside lay calipers, measuring tapes, and a brass instrument designed to gauge cranial circumference. Tools that had ruined lives while pretending to explain them. We will now proceed with physical measurements, Thorne announced. This will be quick. Lydia looked at Webb. For the first time that day, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not fear of pain, but of meaning. She understood numbers. She understood forces. But she was beginning to understand power. Professor Webb, she asked softly, what will these measurements tell you? Webb swallowed. They won't tell us anything about your mind. Then why do them? No one answered. Stand, Thorne ordered. Lydia hesitated only a moment, then rose. She stood straight, hands at her sides, chin level. Clara was not there to tell her to make herself small, and something in Lydia refused to shrink anyway. Thorne approached, calipers in hand. He measured the width of her skull, the length from brow to occipital ridge, the circumference around her temples. He called out numbers while Cartwright wrote them down. Hamilton watched with visible discomfort. The MIT representatives avoided Lydia's eyes. "This is absurd," Webb said finally. "You're measuring bone and pretending it explains thought." "Bone houses thought," Thorne replied. "Structure determines capacity." Lydia spoke quietly. "Then why do two bridges built with identical materials fail differently?" Thorne ignored her. When the measurements were complete, Thorne stepped back, consulting his charts. His brow furrowed. He recalculated, measured again. The numbers refused to cooperate. "Her cranial volume is unremarkable," he said at last. "Entirely within the expected range." Webb seized the opening. "Then your theory fails." "On the contrary," Thorne snapped. "It proves my point. Extraordinary intelligence requires extraordinary physical markers. Since those markers are absent, her performance must be artificial." Hamilton shook his head. "That is not logic. That is dogma." "It is consistency," Thorne said. "Science cannot bend to political sentiment." "This isn't political," Webb said. "It's empirical." Thorne closed the case with a sharp snap. "This examination is concluded." "And your conclusion?" Hamilton asked. Thorne straightened. "That while the subject demonstrates unusual computational ability, there is insufficient evidence to classify her as possessing true intellectual genius. Her performance may be the result of intensive training, memorization, or external coaching. Furthermore, her lack of corresponding physical indicators raises serious doubts about the authenticity of her abilities." Webb felt something inside him fracture. "That's a lie," he said. Thorne smiled thinly. "It's an interpretation." Lydia looked from face to face. "May I ask one question before you decide?" Hamilton nodded. "Yes." "If my skull were larger," she asked, "would my answers today have been more correct?" Silence. "If my skin were lighter," she continued, "would the equations change?" No one spoke. She nodded once. "Then you already know the truth. You just don't want to carry it." The board representatives exchanged uneasy glances. One of them cleared his throat. "Miss Johnson, you may return to your mother." Lydia gathered her coat and walked to the door alone. She did not look back. Outside, Clara wrapped her arms around her daughter, as if reclaiming her from something invisible and poisonous. That night, MIT issued a quiet internal memorandum. Lydia Johnson's access was suspended indefinitely. All notes related to her case were to be sealed. Faculty were instructed not to discuss the matter publicly. Officially, the examination had been inconclusive. Thorne published his rebuttal within weeks. It was cited widely, comfortingly, reassuringly, and yet, quietly, stubbornly, some of Lydia's ideas began appearing elsewhere. A modified approach to load distribution here. A new way of modeling oscillation there. No attribution. Just better mathematics slipping into the world like water finding cracks. Lydia never returned to MIT. But bridges built a decade later stood longer. And some nights, Professor Harrison Webb lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing he had witnessed a truth too large for his century, and lived to watch it be buried alive. A mother who knew danger before it announced itself. Clara searched his face, reading what he hadn't yet said. "They're not finished with her, are they?" she asked. Webb hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. "They want more time," he said carefully. "More study. More control." Clara's jaw tightened. "They want to cage her." They would never use that word. But that's what it means. Webb nodded once. "Yes." They walked Lydia out of the building together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the courtyard. Lydia was quiet now, her earlier composure giving way to something more inward. She had seen the machinery of power up close and understood, perhaps for the first time, that brilliance did not grant immunity. If anything, it painted a target. That night, Webb could not sleep. He replayed Thorne's words, his tone, the way his eyes had lingered on Lydia not with curiosity, but with calculation. Thorne did not need to prove Lydia false. He only needed to bury her in process, in procedure, in endless examination until the world lost interest or Lydia broke under the weight of it. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. It was addressed not to Lydia or Clara, but to the MIT administration, marked confidential. Webb saw it only because a sympathetic clerk slipped him a copy. The language was polite, clinical, almost benevolent. Dr. Thorne recommended temporary protective custody for Lydia Johnson during the review period. A supervised academic environment, controlled access, regular examinations. For her own good, of course. Webb read it twice, then a third time, his hands trembling. Protective custody. He went immediately to the South End. Clara listened as he explained, her face growing paler with each sentence. "They can't do that," she said. "She's my child." "They can," Webb replied quietly. "Legally, they can argue that she is a minor with extraordinary value to the state's scientific interests, especially if they frame it as education." Clara stood, pacing the small room. I told you if this went wrong, I'd run." Webb looked at Lydia. She sat at the table, pencil in hand, sketching something on scrap paper. Not numbers this time, but shapes, interlocking arcs and lines that looked suspiciously like a bridge design. "Lydia," he said gently, "do you understand what may happen next?" She nodded without looking up. "They'll try to take me somewhere I can't leave." "Yes. And if I go," she added, "I won't belong to myself anymore." The clarity of it struck him like a blow. That evening, Webb made a decision that would end his career. He contacted one person outside the academic sphere, an old friend from his student days, now working quietly with abolitionist educators and black mutual aid societies. The message was brief, urgent, dangerous. "They are coming for her. We need a way out." The response came the next morning. "If she disappears, it must look ordinary. Illness, relocation, no confrontation, no noise." MIT moved faster than Webb expected. Within a week, an official notice arrived at the boarding house requesting Lydia's presence for continued educational assessment. It was signed by the board and stamped with authority. Clara did not respond. Instead, she packed. They left before dawn 2 days later. No goodbyes, no forwarding address. Lydia carried only a small satchel filled with notebooks and a single borrowed book on mechanics. Clara left behind everything else. By the time Thorne arrived with a writ and 2 university officials, the room was empty. The landlord shrugged. "Colored woman and her girl? Left sudden. Said family trouble down south." Thorne stood very still. He did not shout. He did not rage. He smiled. "They won't get far," he said. "People like that never do." For weeks, Webb lived in terror that he would be discovered as the architect of their escape. He avoided meetings, spoke carefully, slept poorly, but no accusation came. The board assumed Clara had panicked. Thorne assured them the matter would resolve itself. Privately, he set his own machinery in motion. Across the country, notices circulated quietly. Queries sent to schoolmasters, to reformatories, to charitable institutions. "Have you seen a colored girl of unusual intellect?" Approximately 13. Answers were to be sent directly to Dr. Marcus Thorne. None came. Lydia and Clara moved under borrowed names, passing through safe houses and sympathetic communities. Lydia did not attend school. It was too dangerous. Instead, she read everything she could find, learned from whoever would teach her quietly. Farmers, machinists, builders. She learned by watching, by asking, by seeing the mathematics embedded in ordinary labor. Years passed. The world forgot Lydia Johnson. But mathematics did not. In 1912, an engineering journal published a paper proposing a new method for modeling wind-induced oscillation in long-span bridges. The author cited no inspiration, only observations derived from practical experience. Webb read it and wept. In 1920, a suspension bridge in the Midwest survived a storm that destroyed 3 others built under older assumptions. Engineers called it luck. In 1931, a woman working under a man's name submitted a series of corrections to a widely used structural model. They were dismissed at first, later quietly adopted. Dr. Marcus Thorne died in 1924, his theories already beginning to rot under the weight of new evidence. His name would linger in footnotes and shame, a relic of a science that mistook prejudice for truth. And Lydia? She lived, she learned, she built, but the world would never know her name. Not yet. This is still not the end. When you're ready, say continue, and I'll move into what happens when Lydia's ideas resurface during the age of modern engineering, and why someone finally starts asking where they came from. No lawyer would touch the case. That truth settled over Professor Harrison Webb like a second winter. Each office he visited ended the same way. Averted eyes, careful words, sympathy without action. A Negro child. A state order. A powerful physician with friends in high places. The law, they explained, was not built to protect miracles born in the wrong bodies. After the 5th refusal, Webb stopped asking politely. Instead, he began to listen. Brightwater Institute was not listed in any public medical registry. It did not publish research. Its funding sources were obscured behind charitable trusts and anonymous donors. Yet its name surfaced again and again in whispers, among orderlies who drank too much, among junior doctors who transferred suddenly to other states, among families who had once had children and now spoke of them only in past tense. Webb learned that Dr. Marcus Thorne was not merely affiliated with Brightwater. He had helped design it. Thorne believed genius was a biological aberration, something closer to disease than gift. In private correspondence, Webb uncovered fragments of his philosophy. That extraordinary cognition represented an evolutionary instability, one that required containment, classification, and, if possible, correction. Thorne did not see Lydia Johnson as a child. He saw her as evidence. Inside Brightwater, Lydia learned the cost of being evidence. Her room was clean, bright, and locked. Every surface was white. Every sound carried. She was given food, warm baths, medical attention. She was never beaten, never shouted at, never threatened. Instead, she was tested, endlessly. Equations written and erased. Memory drills that lasted until her head rang. Puzzles designed not to teach, but to exhaust. Doctors who smiled as they asked her to solve problems meant to fracture concentration, to locate limits, to provoke failure. When she succeeded, they recorded. When she faltered, they recorded more eagerly. At night, Lydia lay awake and recited proofs to herself, not to improve them, but to keep them alive. Webb's voice echoed in her mind as she reconstructed lectures from memory, terrified that if she stopped thinking, something inside her would go quiet forever. Dr. Thorne visited once a week. He never raised his voice, never rushed. He spoke to Lydia as one might speak to an intelligent animal, respectful, distant, precise. "You don't belong to yourself," he told her calmly during their 3rd meeting. "Not anymore. Minds like yours belong to history." Lydia looked at him with eyes far older than 13. "History," she said softly, "is just people deciding who gets remembered." Thorne smiled. And in that smile, Lydia understood something with terrible clarity. Brightwater was not trying to understand her. It was trying to outlast her. Outside those stone walls, Harrison Webb reached a conclusion that terrified him. The system would not save Lydia Johnson, so he would have to burn it down instead. "That's not much of a life," Marcus Webb said, quietly. Harrison Webb did not hesitate. "It's still a life. And right now, that's something Brightwater is slowly taking for her." Marcus closed his notebook. "Then we do this clean. Quiet. No heroics." Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus became a shadow around Brightwater Institute. He counted guards, timed patrols, mapped light patterns through barred windows, and learned which doors were locked by habit rather than necessity. Brightwater relied on secrecy more than force. Its greatest protection was the assumption that no one would dare challenge it. The third-floor East Wing was the most secure. Lydia's room sat at the end of a corridor used primarily for special cases, patients deemed too valuable or too dangerous to mix with others. The guards rotated every 6 hours. One smoked, one drank, one prayed. The nurse who had written the letter, known only as E, did what she could. Extra blankets. Food slipped through before appetite disappeared completely. Once, she smuggled Lydia a stub of pencil and 3 sheets of paper. Lydia filled them with equations, not random mathematics, but compressed knowledge. Proofs folded into shorthand symbols, entire frameworks reduced to marks only she would understand. A library written small enough to hide in a pocket. When the papers were taken, she rewrote them in her head. Dr. Thorne noticed the change. "You're resisting," he observed calmly during an examination. "That's unfortunate." "I'm remembering," Lydia replied. Thorne's eyes sharpened. That night, her isolation deepened. The lights stayed on. The tests became longer. The questions were no longer about mathematics, but about obedience, compliance, gratitude. Outside the walls, Harrison Webb prepared to destroy himself. He transferred his savings to Lydia Johnson under an assumed account. He wrote letters of resignation. He did not submit. He copied his research notes and left the originals where they would be found, deliberately unfinished, as if his mind had simply unraveled. Marcus gave him one last chance to stop. "This is the moment you turn back," he said. "Once we do this, there is no returning to your old life." Harrison thought of Lydia reciting proofs in the dark, so she wouldn't disappear inside herself. "There was never a life worth returning to if I let this happen." The plan unfolded on a night of heavy rain, weather that discouraged vigilance. A maintenance door left unsecured. A guard distracted by a bottle. A nurse who looked the other way for exactly 47 seconds. Marcus moved first. Harrison followed, hands shaking but steady enough. They reached Lydia's room without raising an alarm. She was sitting on her bed, eyes open, fully dressed, as if she had been waiting for them her entire life. "I knew you'd come," she said. There was no time for explanations, no time for comfort. They wrapped her in a coat too large for a thin frame, and led her through corridors that smelled of bleach and despair. The alarm sounded as they crossed the grounds. A shout, running footsteps, a gunshot that missed by inches, but the forest swallowed them whole. By dawn, Brightwater Institute had lost its most valuable subject. By dusk, Harrison Webb was no longer a professor, and by morning, the state of Massachusetts had issued warrants that would ensure none of them could ever safely return. But Lydia Johnson was free, for now, and Dr. Marcus Thorne, standing in Lydia's empty room, did not rage. He smiled, because experiments, he believed, were most revealing when the subject ran. And food, and a small room with a desk for Lydia, where she could begin again. The first morning in Toronto, Lydia sat at that desk, her hands tracing the outlines of books Marcus and Harrison had acquired during their escape, volumes on mathematics, physics, astronomy. She had been starved for knowledge, and now the air itself seemed to pulse with possibility. Clara watched her daughter quietly, relief softening her face, though the weight of everything they'd endured still pressed on her shoulders. "Do you want breakfast?" she asked gently. Lydia shook her head, eyes fixed on a problem already forming in her mind. "Later, Mama. I want to write this down before I forget it." John Miller, once Professor Webb, stood behind her, marveling at the audacity of it all. In the span of weeks, he had abandoned his career, his identity, his country's law, and yet he felt an unexpected calm. For the first time in his life, he was doing exactly what mattered. "I'll help you with whatever you need," he said. Days turned into weeks. Lydia learned at a speed that left both her mother and John in awe. She absorbed lessons from books she'd never touched, from mentors Margaret Hawthorne quietly connected them with, from exercises designed to challenge her growing mind. But more than that, she began to reclaim herself. The isolation and examinations that had threatened to break her had not succeeded. Her spirit, ferocious, unyielding, remained intact. Meanwhile, Dr. Marcus Thorne, back in Massachusetts, raged in his study. His definitive test could not be performed. The girl had vanished. His colleagues murmured, unsure what to do next. For Thorne, it was not merely a loss of data. It was the collapse of the narrative he had built his life on. A brilliant child, colored, female, had outmaneuvered him, and nothing in his hierarchy of authority could explain it. In Toronto, Lydia finally looked up from her work and smiled at her mother. I think I can finally learn everything I want." Her eyes sparkled with the same brilliance that had made her a target, now untethered from fear and confinement. Clara hugged her tightly. "And you will, free and safe, and yours to become whoever you are meant to be." John Miller watched the two of them, knowing the cost of freedom had been immense. Yet the prize, Lydia's mind, her life, her future, was worth it all. He also knew this was only the beginning. The world remained a place filled with prejudice and power. But here, in a community that understood the necessity of protecting its own, there was hope. And sometimes, hope was enough. As the sun rose over Toronto, Lydia began writing in earnest, equations spilling across pages, proofs forming with precision, her mind alive, unstoppable. And for the first time in months, she laughed, a small, clear sound that belonged entirely to her, unmonitored, unmeasured, unbroken. The brilliant girl had escaped, and though the world beyond still threatened to test her for the first time, she had the chance to define her own destiny. During that time, Lydia, still living as a ghost behind Harrison's name, continued her private studies, her mind expanding in ways no one could see. She explored areas of mathematics far beyond what a typical prodigy might attempt: non-Euclidean geometry, abstract algebra, complex analysis, and theoretical mechanics. Morrison and the small circle of professors nurtured her, presenting problems that challenged even seasoned academics, guiding without constraining, always aware that her brilliance needed careful protection. Though invisible to the wider world, her mind flourished. Every day she worked for hours on end, sketching proofs on blackboards in secret, scribbling equations in notebooks no one would read, discovering elegant solutions to problems that had stumped experts. Harrison acted as her intermediary, submitting the papers to journals under his name, ensuring they were accepted and respected. The academic community marveled at Harrison Webb's originality, unaware that the true genius behind the work was a 14-year-old girl who had survived trauma and captivity. Her relationship with her mother remained central. Clara provided stability and care, making certain Lydia was never pushed beyond her limits. The quiet domestic life in Toronto, meals, walks through the city, small joys of normality, kept Lydia anchored in humanity in contrast to the cold, measured environment of bright water. Harrison monitored her progress, but also her well-being, constantly balancing the demands of her mind with the fragility of her recovery. The arrangement was isolating in a different sense. Lydia could never reveal herself, never claim her victories publicly. She was brilliant yet unseen, accomplished yet invisible. Still, she pressed forward, driven by the love of knowledge itself rather than recognition. And over the years, the papers continued to push boundaries, influencing fields and inspiring ideas, even if no one knew the true author. By 1913, Lydia was 29. Her mind had become legendary within the small circle of professors who knew her secret. Yet outside, the world only saw Harrison Webb, the unconventional mathematician, as the source of groundbreaking theories. Lydia, though hidden, had survived, thrived, and ensured that the knowledge she had fought so hard to preserve would endure. The ghost of bright water remained in memory, a reminder of the cruelty she had escaped. But through invisibility, careful guardianship, and relentless intellect, she carved out a space where genius could exist safely, even in a world unwilling to acknowledge it. If you like, I can continue with a reflection on how Lydia's legacy quietly shaped mathematics and the hidden influence she had on the early 20th century, showing the long-term consequences of her invisible contributions. This continuation is heartbreaking and illuminating. Lydia Johnson's story is a stark illustration of how brilliance can survive incredible adversity, yet remain invisible to the world. Her life raises profound questions about the systems that erased genius, the cost of survival under oppression, and the moral compromises made to protect extraordinary talent. Even as Lydia contributed groundbreaking mathematics, intuitive, elegant, decades ahead of her time, she was erased by circumstance and society. Harrison Webb's protective strategy allowed her work to live, but at the cost of her identity. Thorne's false account in the question of Negro intelligence wasn't just an insult, it was an existential erasure, a rewriting of history designed to nullify her existence. That Lydia endured decades of anonymous contribution and later isolated brilliance, all while mourning her mother and her lost public self, underscores both the resilience of the human mind and the cruelty of societal structures that value some lives over others. The discovery by Jennifer Morrison in the 21st century restores some justice, yet it's also a painful reminder. Lydia's genius remained invisible for a century, and countless others were likely never found. Her notebooks revealed contributions to information theory, computational theory, and quantum mechanics long before the wider world would recognize those fields, proof that talent, when suppressed, doesn't vanish, but society loses immeasurably. Her story forces us to ask difficult questions. How many Lydias never survived? How many were silenced before their work could be documented? How many brilliant lives ended in anonymity simply because the world refused to acknowledge their existence? Lydia's life wasn't just a story of genius, it's a mirror to systemic erasure, a call to uncover the hidden figures history forgot. In the end, Lydia Johnson existed, thought, created, and advanced human knowledge. Even if the world didn't see her, her mind left a mark. Silent, unseen, but profound, her story reminds us that recognizing brilliance isn't just about celebration, it's about justice. If you want, I can condense Lydia Johnson's entire life and legacy into a sharp, 5-minute narrative version that captures both her brilliance and the tragedy of her erasure, suitable for telling in a lecture, podcast, or video format. It would be distilled but emotionally and historically powerful. Do you want me to do that?